Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of hidden processes behind aging and youth.
So we think that speaker is too treble.
Too treble? All right. What do we do?
Right. All of Keep talking.
Well, I know of no subject, either within the field of the occult or outside of it, which is soaked in such garments of nonsense and misunderstanding as the subject of aging. Of course, there have been charlatans right down through the centuries who have pretended to have an elixir of life. We're all anxious to live a little longer than our souls would have us, and therefore we are always receptive to suggestions which might prolong the agony of existence in this very material world. When you come to study the current literature, medical and otherwise, on the subject of aging, well, the mind boggles at what is presented. I just sat and began to jot down some of the supposed medical and otherwise factors affecting aging. Those which are said, for instance, to prolong life amount to more than 200. In fact, many of them imply that life results from not being killed, or aging results from not being killed, and I'm not surprised. I think the figures in the United States of America for diseases of iatrogenic origin, by that we mean being killed by your doctors, amount to something like 3 million per year. And I'm sure they're not much better in England. Aging. These are some of the factors which are said to save you from an early death, or to affect the issue as to whether you will live a long time or not. It is said the age of retiring affects how long you will live. If you retire too early, you die too early. It is said that if you live the life of an ascetic with moderation to the point of agony on things like alcohol and eating and so on, then you might live to be quite old. It is even suggested that royal jelly, the food that changes a worker bee into a queen bee, might have something to do with producing old age. It is said that if you have your blood changed for the blood of a youth, that this can give you at least 3 weeks of scampering around like a young person before you revert once more to the aged state. It is said that calcium metabolism, the way in which you use up or don't use calcium in your body, this can affect the aging process. We do know that if the water in your district is hard, then you tend to live longer and don't get cancer so frequently. Whereas if you have soft water in your area, there is definitely a correlation between the high incidence of cancer and soft water. The speed in which your wounds will heal tends to indicate the age of your body physiologically. If your wounds heal quickly, then it is known, you look at me as if I'm cracking jokes, but this is the current literature on the subject, and the most advanced literature. And I'm speaking medically as well as from the point of view of philosophers' attitude to the subject. So the speed at which you heal indicates your age. If you heal quickly, then you're physiologically still very young. Some of us possess, as I said, lethal genes which are going to kill us no matter what happens. Some of us, it is said, possess a heartbeat which is too fast, and that the number of heartbeats affect the age to which we will live. Then there is, of course, obesity. And I am a living example of somebody who's reaching the age of 50 without being struck down by obesity or overweight. Then there is sexual activity. If you do without it, it's said to prolong life. On the other hand, we have many examples of nonagenarians, as that it, who are married at the age of 90 or something and manage to produce some sort of sexual activity and go on to the age of 100 or more. Alcoholism is said to affect the age at which we are likely to die, and smoking, and pantothenic acid, one of the vitamins, and whether we eat an excessive amount of proteins or not. Some say that if you eat plenty of proteins, then the tissues will last longer. Others say that if you eat a lot of proteins, you will die earlier, and so on. If you starve yourself, especially when you're young, then it is an indication that you will tend to live much longer. If you have a high metabolic rate, the rate at which the cells will burn up energy, then you will live less. If you now and again have a shot of testosterone, then you can have quite an enjoyable old age. Organ grafting can affect the issue. Whether you have monkey glands grafted onto you or whether they are sheep glands doesn't seem to affect the issue very much. May I just issue a warning from an occult point of view that you may have a karma extending over many lives to work off if you graft animal glands onto your human body. Then there is current theories about eating crushed brain material and so on. Now I'm not going to go on because I got tired of writing them down after that. What, however, is very true is this, that the organs of our bodies tend to grow old unevenly. Most organs in the body can live and should live for 150 years or more, but some of them wear out much quicker, and the biggest culprits in this respect are the arteries of the body. If we could have our arteries replaced every now and again, perhaps every 50 years, we could probably go on to live to the age of 150 or 200, but these let us down. As you probably know, the greatest cause of death today is cardiovascular diseases of the heart and blood system. And it isn't the muscle of the heart that dies so easily. It isn't this that wears out. It is the arteries that feed the heart muscle. The arteries that pump the blood containing oxygen to the heart muscle. These are the culprits which cause early death. And so we then come to the subject proper, the subject of aging. Medical science will tell us that we are as old as our arteries. And the aging of arteries is called atheroma. Atheroma, a process whereby there is deposition of calcium in the walls of the arteries. Calcium cracks form, and there is furring up of the artery walls, just as you might expect in old drain pipes. And this occurs and continues to occur as we go into old age. And this furring up of the arteries is accelerated by various conditions. Now, I have a lot to say on this subject tonight, and I'm going to ask you to give me 10 minutes in which I need not be melodramatic and give you one of my research discoveries in respect of the aging of the arteries, research at an occult level. I'll deal with that later. It may be of some help to you one of these days. Then the yogis will say that our age depends on the number of breaths that we take, the number of breaths, and that if we learn to control the breathing, if we learn to be able to regulate the breathing and to be able to suspend it, or to breathe rhythmically, or to breathe through one nostril and alternate it with breathing through another, this enables us to prolong life. Medicine would merely say this could possibly be true if you merely consider the fact that the elasticity of the lungs might be prolonged if we don't use them quite so often and if we breathe less. Because medicine does not yet accept the fact that there is prana in the atmosphere, that man does not live by bread alone, but is sustained not only by food, but also by pranic emanations coming from the sun, which link up with the vitality globule in our atmosphere. The yogis will say that it is the prana that is the life-giving force and not the energy of food. Some say that we are as old as our endocrine glands. And this would probably be a very wise observation in view of what I'm going to tell you a little later. There is, of course, a whole school of medicine centered around the fact that the endocrine glands might be the organs that give out first in the process of aging, and that whilst your muscles and you're for 150 years, some of the endocrine glands begin to peter out, the ductless glands. And there is the school centered around Dr. Nierhans in Switzerland, which suggests that the grafting of glandular cells, endocrine glands from animals, can prolong life. And there is an imposing list of people who have had such grafts, which are said to include Adenauer of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, I think in the 1950s, the Duke of Windsor, a Pope, unnamed, I think you can all guess who it was, and some say that even General de Gaulle have had this process. Now, I can only tell you that amongst my various investigations into unusual methods of healing, that I investigated this field of grafting glands along with the Master Robert Browning. And the views of Robert Browning on this subject can only be imagined. He was quite categoric as to the devastating effect on the karma of the individual and the effect on the individual's etheric body in future lives if anybody dared to use such a device for producing an extra 5, 10 or 15 years tacked onto his life through the grafting of animal glands. Be warned about it. You know, people can be very stupid. I had a very dear friend in England who used to write in an occult paper who had born to him a mongoloid child, a child with one extra chromosome. And he believed passionately that it might be possible to turn this Mongol child into a normal individual, and saved for many years to produce enough money to take the boy to Switzerland and have the operation done. It was done. It made no difference at all. You know, our cells, the cells of our body, have the capacity for immortality. It is possible to take cells from our body and keep them alive for many hundreds of years. So it is believed. This hasn't been done yet. But cells taken from people who lived and died as early as 1910 are still alive today. These cells can, being put into a proper medium of salts and refreshed each day with infusions of and cleaning out of waste material, these cells can go on multiplying and multiplying without any sign of age. Our cells have this capacity virtually of immortality to live forever. But when they are brought together, when the kidney cells have to be limited by being brought together with the liver cells into the organism of the human body or into any other organisms of that type, then this limitation, this imposed limitation curtails their length of life. Bringing them together and making them work together seems to lose this capacity that they have of immortality. Man's death occurs because one particular group of cells fail, while others could go on for many centuries in their capacity to withstand wear and tear. Then there are, of course, the group of people who say that we are as old as we feel. We are as old as we feel. And the attitude that we have towards life indicates how old we are. There are people who are very old and yet have a young attitude to life, and they will maintain that they are still young in outlook and therefore in fact. And so we have then three kinds of age. There is the physiological age of the body, there's the actual age of the body as enumerated by calendar years, and then there is the psychological age of one's body. And I'm in sympathy with this last observation. How do we assess the psychological age of an individual? I look around myself and meet many people, and sometimes I'm staggered by the way in which people have failed to live their years. You can assemble in one room 3, 4, 10 people who are 50 years of age. And although they may be 50 years measured by the calendar, how different they are in actual fact of living those years. How very different. I began to follow this line of thought and began to jot down some of the years of my life. My 6 years of infancy, which would allow any child. And then my number of years at the normal schooling, numbering 12. Then 3 years at college. Then 13 years at university. And 5 years in the army. And 8 years employed with the company John Dickinson & Co. And 7 years self-employed in my own printing company. And 8 years of teaching children in a well-known school organization in England. And now 8 years of medicine, practicing medicine. And 21 years as editor and lecturer of subjects of occult nature all over the world. and 5 years of medical research, and it makes 97. It makes 97. Maybe I have the wisdom of a person of 97. Pray God it is true. God knows I've suffered enough. Age is relative. And it really is, you know. And some of the people you met, you think they act like 2-year-olds, and they damn well are. Even though they may be 50 calendar years. So do bear this in mind when you start to delve into the subject of aging and youth. And this must, of course, bring us to the subject of organ transplants. Because if you could transplant an organ that was wearing out, whereas the other organs would go on for another 100 years, it could be considered quite useful. After all, it is an awful waste, you know, to think that the soul must come in, and the soul must tap its foot in each incarnation and wait for that vehicle to go through the 20 years of growing up, the same old damn mistakes, the same business of puberty and all that emotional nonsense as the child grows into adulthood, and repeats the same mistakes that he's made year after year, life after life, and the soul has to wait. And perhaps in each life that the soul may only get 5 years of fruitful existence out of that particular life. It's a hell of a waste. No wonder there is a new method adopted by the hierarchy of masters, which many of you will one day share. It is the method of not, in the last few lives that you live on this earth, not going through the process of ordinary incarnation, of having to take on a baby's body and go through all that goo-goo and gaga stage again. You know what I'm talking about. You can sometimes see the wisdom of many lives staring out of the eyes of young babies, can't you? Oh, yes. And the masters will say, well, this is an awful waste of energy, and it is allowed for. And as somebody particularly asked me about this subject today, let me give you the instance of Robert Browning, and as I have given you before, the instance of H.P. Blavatsky. Very hard to ask the Master Robert Browning in his 80th or so year to go through all the nonsense of taking on a baby's body again. And so when he did die in the year 1889, he stayed in the astral plane for some time, 5 or 6 years, and then began to overshadow a young body, the body of a young man that was being prepared for him by his own beloved Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She had died in 1853 and had almost immediately reincarnated in the body of a baby and grew up as a young man and prepared that body for Robert. And Robert began to overshadow and took possession of that body. And this is a process which is increasingly going to be used. And some of us in the last few lives, what I call the run-in, will be spared this process of having to go through childhood again, and will be allowed, as an act of dedication by some disciple, will be allowed to take over a body and obviate this necessity. And so you find then that Robert Browning would have a continuity of consciousness from the time of his, virtually after the time of his birth, right up to the present time, or when he took the 6th initiation and no longer operated in the field of English affairs. Organ transplants, a very confusing subject. The Tibetan master, the Master D.K., has forecast. 20 years ago he 40 years ago he forecast that organ transplants would occur, and that in fact cadavers would be reassembled, corpses would be reassembled, and would be infused with some sort of energy to bring them into life and to be activated. But he said that this is a dead end, that will merely be an activated corpse, that a living body, a living physical body with an etheric vehicle does not imply that that body has an emotional nature, an astral body appended to it, that it has a mentality, or that it has above all else a spiritual entity or soul within it. No, this is not a way. Organ transplant may produce an extension of life of some years, but they are not to become what we believe as a panacea for producing old age. Men could, if you like, live indefinitely if banks were established to replenish some failing organ. And of course the organ that everybody thinks of is the organ that is usually the cause of death, and that is the heart. We've had spectacular results with the transplantation of limbs. We've had spectacular results with the transplantation of kidneys and even of the liver, that extraordinarily toxic organ. If ever an organ shouldn't accept a transplant, it would be the liver. And yet it has. And people live with transplanted livers. And yet the heart, which is only a muscular organ, will not accept a transplant. And I gave my reasons very clearly 10 years ago why the human heart is a special organ and cannot be transplanted, and for many, many years will not be successfully transplanted. And I have been proved correct in this respect. The heart is rejected. Even today, with all that we know, we still find that a heart grafted onto another individual with its arteries, its coronary arteries, we find that the coronary arteries of the transplanted organ flare up inexplicably, and the organ is ultimately not accepted by the receiver. The heart is a special organ. Why is it a special organ? It is an outpost, firstly, of the vagus nerve. The vagus, the right and the left vagus nerve, find their way into the human heart and affect or moderate the rate of the heartbeat. But this isn't the reason why the heart is such a special organ. There is a center in the heart called the sinus node, from which derives the sensitivity of the heart. Waves of impulse well up through the strange piece of tissue of the human heart in the right atrium. And these waves, these excitatory waves, flow through the heart muscle. We don't know why heart muscle has this capacity. The ancient teaching is that there is a stream of force coming from the solar logos himself, which finds its way into the right atrium of the human heart, producing the rhythmic beat of the human heart. And it is because of this factor that the human heart is so very special, and that grafting of tissue there is not going to be accepted for many, many long years. I don't want to go into the whole subject of transplants. You can find it in my journal Aquarium. But what we do know is this, that the human heart has as its endocrine gland the thymus gland, and as its chakram the heart center. For it is the heart center that energizes the human heart, the muscular heart. And the quality of the heart chakram, which energizes the human heart, amongst others, the quality of this chakram is to determine what is the not self. If you would develop the human heart chakram, one of the things that develops it is your discriminatory capacity for what is not self. And we're going to go into that tonight. Not self can apply at all levels. That which is not me at a spiritual level, that which is not me at a mental level, that which is not me at an astral level, and that which is not me at a physical level. And we know that the human body rejects the not self at a physical level. Graft a piece of animal tissue onto your body and the body will reject it. It's not me. It's not myself. And we go through the whole process in discipleship of determining what is the self and what is not the self. This is a natural characteristic of the human entity at all levels. And it is one of the reasons why the heart, linked to the heart chakram, is an organ that will resist transplantation, and those arteries will always flare up whilst this situation exists. But there are modifications to what I say. However, this is not a subject that I can go into tonight. Almost every organ of the body has been investigated from the point of view of producing prolongation of life. Almost every process in the body has been experimented with. There has been vegetarian diet, there has been sexual abstinence, there has been moderation of one's temper, and so on. Ministers of religion are said to live longer because they live in comfort and they are moral and they are so on and so on. Every aspect possible in the human personality, in the human's mentality, his emotional nature, and his physical structure has been investigated. And still we can't find out what it is that produces old age. Why not? Because the medical world, the world of materialism, which is so interested in prolongation of life, is only considering the physical body. It is not investigating an etheric body, which is the real energizer of flesh. It does not consider this astral body that we spent a whole evening on last night. It does not consider the mental nature nor of the soul. And that's why the secret of aging and youth is not understood yet and never will be. Now, the ancient wisdom gives a clear teaching on the subject. I was going to say I've been deprived of an answer, but I have one. The ancient wisdom is quite clear on the subject. The ancient wisdom will say that the process of aging, as with any other bodily function, is greatly dependent upon primarily these so-called chakrams or four centers that we are talking about, and which I draw on this board time and again ad nauseum. They will say that these chakras act through endocrine glands, the throat center acting through the thyroid gland, the heart chakram acting through the thymus gland, the center at the base of the spine acting through the adrenal gland, the center of the solar plexus acting through the pancreas organ. It is a teaching of the ancient wisdom that it is the integrity of these chakrams which will decide how the endocrine glands work, and through the endocrine glands how aging will proceed. And if these chakrams are fully enlivened, if they are not overstimulated, if they are not retarded or understimulated, and if they are coordinated with each other, then life can be prolonged indefinitely. For this is the quality of a master. A master has his chakrams entirely functioning, coordinated, and integrated. But we do not. Each chakram of ours is linked to another two. Each chakram is linked to another two. And if we had our centers fully aroused and coordinated with their other two, making up a triangle in every instance, we too would have perfect endocrine balance. We too would live to great ages. But there are factors which restrict the activity of these centers. You see, the endocrine glands through which these centers operate are vitally placed in the body. The throat chakram works through the thyroid and affects the rate of metabolism of the cells of the body. But we have already seen that science is aware of the fact that the rate of metabolism can affect the life processes, can prolong or reduce aging. We have the example of a mouse as compared to a horse. If you take the tissue of mice and the tissue of horse, you will find that in comparing both, the horse will burn about 28 calories per kilogram of flesh, whereas the mouse will burn 128 calories of energy per kilogram of flesh. And the mouse lives but a few years, 2 or 3 years, compared to that of a horse, which may live 20 or to 30 years. And so we could go in ad nauseum into all these endocrinal factors. We know, for instance, that the anterior pituitary glands affects the growth of the sexual organs. And the sexual organs have been shown again and again to affect the life processes and the aging processes. Again, endocrine glands. The parathyroid glands of the throat, related again to the throat center, affect the amount of calcium in the body. If there is too much calcium or too little calcium, aging occurs. The suprarenal glands lying above the kidneys affect the drive of the individual. The adrenal medulla produces the opposite of relaxation, and it's been shown that people who can't relax but are tense and may even produce high blood pressure, these people are susceptible to early death. The level of sugar in the blood is affected by an endocrine gland, the pancreas, linked to the solar plexus center. And so we see that the endocrine glands, which are only the physical counterpart of the chakrams, are strategically placed in the human body to produce conditions which will allow a person to live longer or shorter. So there is a basis for all that the ancient wisdom says. And if there are chakrams, if Dr. Karagula is not a liar, this woman, this doctor who lives in California and produced the book Breakthrough to Creativity, a doctor who has worked with the finest research brain specialists in England and America, if what she says is true, that there are people who can see the chakrams and can see the chakrams hesitating when the body's in a state of imbalance, if those chakrams are there, and if they are linked to the endocrine glands, then surely they affect the process of aging. If the chakrams are there, then the yogis are not liars. And it is the yogis who can produce miracles with the human body, which confuse Western medicine. The ancient wisdom says the chakrams, and as they work through the endocrine glands, are paramount in aging. You know, we constantly refer to the masters. You might say, oh, well, it's all very well saying that a master may live for 200 or 300 or 400 years until his work is ended. But where are the masters? Do they exist? I always think of people who doubt whether masters exist. I like to compare them to a person that has been born and grown up on a desert island. And all his life he's heard nothing but the sighing of the waves lapping on the shores of that desert island. And to such a person the music of Beethoven and Mozart could never exist when he has heard only the sighing of the waves. He would deny that it was possible that the music of Beethoven and Mozart could exist because he had known nothing else. And some of us reject the existence of masters because we have never known them or known any of their qualities. But they're there. And so aging is accelerated or retarded by the state of our chakrams, whether they're overactive or underactive, and so on. And what forces affect our chakrams? The forces known as those embodied energies of the 7 rays. A teaching difficult enough to give out in the world, hard enough, which I have dedicated my life to expounding. These 7 qualities of energy that I shall spend most of my talk tomorrow night in discussing. And we have a new age. And each age is an age which is affected by particular rays. For the last 2,000 years, the age of Pisces brought out the 6th ray of devotion and idealism. It was the age of the religious fanatic, the devotee, the idealistic religious person. And because that ray was a manifestation, it produced certain diseases. There were the diseases of anemia. Overstimulation of the etheric body produces anemia. A 2nd ray quality, really, linked also to the 6th ray, which is in affinity with the 2nd. What are the diseases that are going to be peculiar and which will affect the aging processes in man in the Aquarian age? Remembering, of course, that Aquarius is ruled exoterically by Uranus and esoterically by Jupiter. The Aquarian age will produce stimuli which will affect the head centers and the will-guided centers of the body. And there will be an increase of mental disorders in the Aquarian age, in their types and in their extent. And palliation, the reduction of these mental disorders, will be through the planet Jupiter and Jupiterian qualities. And if we can reduce congestion in individuals in the Aquarian age, it will offset mental disorders. There is a prognosis based on astrological rationales. So we come to the problem of senescence, old age, related to the rays. And many of you know your rays, many of you suspect your rays. All of you have vehicles which are energized by the rays. The physical body has its own particular ray and will be flooded by it and will be constantly receptive to it. Then there is the astral body which has its own ray affecting it. And that ray will constantly energize the astral body. there is a mental body which will be also affected by its particular ray. The mental body has a ray. And the blending of these three rays produces the ray of the personality. The personality being a combination of the physical body and its influences, the astral body and its influences, and the mental body and its influences. These three blend together to produce the personality ray. And finally, there is the ray of the soul, the higher triad, which makes the totality of man. And each man is infused with 5 rays. And so it is nonsense to say one is on a particular ray. Such a person is probably on the Wu ray. The rays do affect the aging processes. People with a preponderance of the will rays, with a bias towards the first ray of will and power, whether it is in their physical bodies, and there are about 7% of an audience would have a first ray physical body, whereas about 12% would have a first ray astral body, and about 8% would have a first ray mental body, and about 3% would have a first ray personality body, and about 30% would have a first ray soul. Those who are responding to the first ray in any of these bodies will be people who will produce in the world will, drive, initiative, and tension. And they will tend to deprive themselves of adequate rest and diversion. Diversion in the form of play, in the form of relaxation, in sport and hobbies and so on. And the first ray is the ray of crystallization. And more than anything else, it is the influence of this ray which will affect the deposition of calcium in the walls of the arteries, which all of us are susceptible to. The influence of the first ray excessively will produce this factor. Now, I have done a bit of research, occult research, into the subject of arteriosclerosis. I have also, as you well know, delved into the field of the effect of magnetism on the tissues of the body. We have found that magnetic fields tend to reduce the deposition of calcium in the walls of arteries. In fact, constant treatment with magnetism has produced a more flexible condition to the arteries, whereas they had become rigid with calcium. By constant treatment with magnetism, the ionized calcium is removed from the walls of the arteries, and the arteries again become resilient and susceptible to nervous impulses. We know this through our experiments with magnetism. What is not known in the world is something which I must bore most of you with for 5 minutes. However, I intend to say it, and you must hear me out. Some of you might even find it interesting. This room is filled with atmosphere. 4/5 of that atmosphere is nitrogen. 4/5 of everything that we breathe in to our lungs is nitrogen. And nitrogen is a precious material. The body needs it in order to live. No cell will divide. The body will stop repairing itself. The body will stop growing without nitrogen. And nitrogen can only be taken, so medicine says, into the body by eating it in the form of proteins. Despite the fact that this atmosphere is laden with nitrogen, the medical world, the world of science, will say that although we take the nitrogen into our lungs, we breathe it out again. We don't use it. We can't use it. Even though some plant cells are able to obtain nitrogen and use it, atmospheric nitrogen, in ways which are devious and I'm not going to go into tonight. Even though that is so, science will say that we do not use the nitrogen of the atmosphere. We only get it from proteins. The ancient wisdom says nonsense to that. The ancient wisdom says that the walls of arteries, especially those in the vicinity of the heart, here, those walls are able, under certain conditions, to take up nitrogen out of the blood, that nitrogen which is coming through the lungs and into the blood. And this capacity to take nitrogen out of the blood directly from the atmosphere as it gets into the blood enables yogis to live for many, many long months, even years, without having to eat nitrogen in the form of protein. The human body is able to take it out of the blood. When you are vegetarian, it does just this. A low diet of animal protein will mean that an impulse is given to the pituitary gland, which will does secrete a hormone undiscovered by man yet, which affects the walls of the arteries, so that the walls of the arteries will take up nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen from the blood. That is an undiscovered medical fact, but an occult proposition which I know to be true. Now, if you eat a large amount of animal protein, then the pituitary gland does not induce the cells to take up nitrogen from the blood, because there is so much animal protein in the blood already, animal nitrogen in the blood. And those cells in the walls of the arteries no longer take up the nitrogen. The nitrogen is trapped. The walls of those cells now, the cells in the walls of those arteries now do not use the nitrogen. It becomes sterile, as it were, unused, and deterioration of the walls occurs. Cholesterol fat is deposited. Calcium is deposited there, and you get furring up. This is why there is a correlation between the vast amounts of protein, animal protein eaten, in the form of fats and proteins, animal fats and proteins eaten, and deterioration of the walls of the arteries, especially of those in the region of the heart. Aging can be reduced, and we would confirm this by vegetarianism, certainly. And I will say this, that aging of the arteries can be reduced by placing the subject in magnetic fields, especially magnetic fields oscillating at the frequency of 256 cycles per second, which is the sound of the solar logos, the natural sound of the Om in our solar system. Ray 1 affects the aging processes, the deposition of calcium in the walls of the arteries. Ray 2, the ray of love wisdom, will affect the organs of the body in such a way as to be tumor-producing, cancer-producing. Excessive ray 2 energies produce anemia, and they also encourage cells to produce supernumerary cells in the form of tumors and cancers. Ray 3, the ray of active intelligence. Excessive stimulation by this ray produces intestinal disorders. The excessive production of ray, I'm sorry I've lost ray 4, but something happened with my little bit of research there. Perhaps I didn't agree with it, and I've thrown it out. So you'll have to excuse me. But ray 5, excessive energies of ray 5 produce tendencies towards migraine and brain lesions and mental disorders, such as the tendency towards cruelty and so on. Ray 6, excessive ray 6 produces aging through excessive emotional upsets. We'll have something to say about that later. Also sexual disorders, often leading in women to hysterectomy, the necessity for hysterectomy. And excessive ray 7 stimulation produces susceptibility to infections and epidemics. And many people with ray 7 in their ray complement in childhood were very susceptible to picking up all the childhood infections, whereas other children without the 7th ray in their complement have escaped such epidemics. I can see that the people with recorders here are getting agitated, so I'm going to have a break for 10 minutes whilst they recharge their organs. Thank you. Against excessive aging. I have dealt with magnetism. I have a magnetic instrument next to my bed continuously, and I treat myself at least 3 times a week for half an hour. It's the easiest treatment in the world. You lie down and have a rest, and the 7 over the thyroid gland, 1 over the gallbladder, 1 over each of the adrenal glands, and 1 behind the calf of each leg. And in my opinion, this has helped me tremendously in my work. Now, other methods of palliation against aging or senescence. I had a long talk to Dr. Riley, who was the doctor used by Edgar Cayce, as you know. I spent a couple of days with Riley in New Jersey, and he emphasized 4 procedures which assist the body in resisting old age. He emphasized that any method for increasing the circulation you must do a minimum of exercise each day. And the minimum of exercise should be the equivalent of walking 4 miles. Walking is an excellent exercise. When we say exercise here, we don't mean weightlifting. We mean a fairly natural sort of exercise. We don't mean body press-ups. Do you call them that in this country? We mean walking or swimming, natural methods of using the limbs. But it should be regular, and this is excellent for reducing deposition of calcium and fats in the walls of arteries. The second thing, after increasing the circulation, is to ensure that you eliminate correctly. Now, I'm a great believer in this aspect, elimination. Elimination is very, very important. Get rid of it. There is no suggestion that I can make with more emphasis with regard to health than elimination. And I'm speaking now at all levels. We are all of us energized from within. I talked to you last night about this process of putting the physical body to sleep, keeping the mind alert, and allowing the inner vehicles to recharge. You can all do this, but one thing that you should try and do more than anything is to increase the elimination capacity of the body. The body is just, I always think of the body like an air drogue. Do you know what an air drogue is? By that we mean a sleeve that hangs in the wind at an airport, and it indicates to the pilots the direction of the wind. And all that the human body is a vehicle for channeling energy. That's all it is. And the more energies that you pass through the human body, especially from higher levels, the more it can take. There is no such thing as overwork in terms of soul energy. The energies from within must be expressed. And people say to me, where do you get your energy from? And as I've told you before, I answer back, I get rid of it. That's where I get it from. I get rid of it. And in giving it out, you are given. There is no truer statement in health than that. But you must express it freely. It's no good saying, all right, I'll damn well go and walk 4 miles a day if you insist on it. And you trudge yourself off for 4 miles walk with a long look on your face and come back furious. It must be energy freely expressed. And if you feel, as I often feel, that exercise is a damn waste of energy to me, I've got lots of things I can do exercising myself which are useful. I can't afford exercise. I haven't the time for it. I would far rather sit and do some manual work with my hands than go out trudging through the countryside. But I'm doing that far more willingly. And I'm expressing my energy. Now that's the secret, is to get rid of the energy by expressing it. So many of you cannot express yourselves at a spiritual, at a mental, at an emotional, and at a physical level. And it is when energies pour into you, like that second-rate energy of overstimulating the blood system causing anemia. That's where disease, that's where aging comes from. When energies are flowing in and are not got rid of through natural expression. Now, I couldn't tell you anything truer in all the lectures that I've given you here than that. Expression, getting rid of the energy creatively. And most disease is as the result of this dis-ease in people. The inability to express themselves mentally, they're frustrated. I've said time and time again that this Aquarian age is characterized by geniuses. That is Aquarius. Aquarius and the ruler Uranus. Uranus is genius. the rare genius, and our age is full of geniuses. But the poor devils have only got that. They come in with a spark of genius, the seed of genius. I meet them every day of my life. Wonderful minds. They've got the seed, the sperm of genius, but they lack the phallus for implanting that seed. They lack the phallus for implanting it. They haven't got that other something which will ensure that their seed of genius can be planted into fertile conditions and will grow. That's the problem of the age at this moment. And we would expect it on the frontier of an age, before the age is actually developed. And these people become frustrated. They know what should be, but they can't put it into operation. They can't express it. So many people can write, but can't get their articles printed. I know, I can see on your faces that you understand what I'm talking about. You sometimes have wonderful meditations. You sometimes say, oh, I wish I could give that lecture. I have something to say, but you can't. I'm not saying why you can't. I'm not saying it's because George Morgan won't put you on the platform. I'm not saying that it's because you're short or you're uneducated or it's this or that. It's not the point. The point is that people don't express themselves. Now this occurs also at a physical level. And elimination of waste products, I don't have to talk to you about the horrors of constipation. I'm not going to go into such sordid details. Unfortunately, most of you, when you think about physical elimination, only think of constipation. There are other ways of eliminating. We eliminate through the skin. And the esotericists will tell you time and again that a clean skin is vital from the point of view of circulation of magnetic forces of the aura. Always see that the skin is kept immaculate. For this will produce a choke. If there is impurity in the skin, it will produce a choking of the magnetic circulations. But we eliminate in various ways, not only through the bowel, but also through the skin and through the lungs. The lungs are an excretory organ. They excrete carbon dioxide, and we don't use them. As you're sitting now, each one of you is breathing in about half a pint of air. The lung capacity is about 11 pints. How often do we use our lungs to the extent of stretching them to take in 11 pints? Very, very rarely. The yoga proposition that I gave you a little earlier is that you could stretch the lungs perhaps once to take in 11 pints instead of having to do it 22 times to take in 22 half pints. Of course, it's a mathematical formula. Elimination, extremely important. Learning to breathe rhythmically. Learning to breathe intercostally. I can see by your faces that you are a miserable lot. You don't know any biology, you don't know any yoga, and practically no astrology. And when I talk about intercostal breathing, you think I'm talking about a place on Mars. Intercostal diaphragmatic breathing. It's a lovely expression, isn't it? Breathing with two parts of the body. Abdominal breathing, or what we call diaphragmatic breathing, which is at the floor of the rib cage, and breathing with the ribs. Breathing with the ribs is the important breathing for the disciple. How this method of breathing eliminates is not our concern here. But I can tell you this, that breathing with the intercostal part of our mechanism stimulates chakrams above the diaphragm, and that's your concern. And if there is any imbalance, if there is any dis-ease condition above the diaphragm, concerned with centers above the diaphragm, intercostal breathing is the best method. You should learn about it. Breathing with this part of the chest, not with the diaphragmatic part of the prima donna. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. The third thing is assimilation. It's no good putting food into the mouth and passing it out without anything happening to it. It needs to be taken into the body. And there are various subtle little implications here about the assimilation of food, the absorption of the food which you put into the alimentary canal. When you put food into the tube, which begins at the mouth and ends at the anus, the food is not inside the body. It's in that tube.